Justin Trudeau pledges to sign an international agreement to tackle violence and hate online. It's a short intro, but it will be a long discussion. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. I was planning on covering multiple articles today, but after seeing this first headline, I knew there simply wouldn't be time. This is a major issue, and I want to do it justice by giving it my full attention. So without further ado, let's dive right in. This week, Trudeau is attending what's being referred to as the Christchurch Call meeting, which is occurring in Paris. World leaders from around the globe are gathering at this meeting in relation to the horrendous shooting that occurred in New Zealand last month. This was the same attack that targeted mosques and left over 50 people dead, with dozens more injured. The scope of the meeting is aimed at getting government and social media companies to work together to curb the spread of violent and extremist online content. As the different parties were delegating, one of the proposals that cropped up was an international pledge for governments to take action against dangerous rhetoric. The New Zealand PM, Jacinda Ardern, my apologies if I pronounced that wrong, and the French President Emmanuel Macron are the co-chairs of the event as they host a bunch of other world diplomats and leadership figures. Trudeau, as I mentioned, was there, and he voiced his concern that social media platforms are increasingly being weaponized as tools to incite, publish, and broadcast extremist violence and hatred. I must make a distinction here that these world leaders seem to ignore. Violence and hatred are not the same thing. Lumping them together as if they are synonymous is disingenuous, and it skews the proposal by misleading the sentiments here. They are both issues in their own right, but the same approach to both topics might not optimize for the best results that we're all looking for. I'll get to that more in just a second. Let's dive back to the article first. After much discussion, Trudeau joined a bunch of the other world leaders in signing a pledge, or rather, Trudeau didn't sign it yet, but he's made the promise to do so. And the pledge, it's very important to note, is a non-binding agreement. In other words, you cannot follow up with your obligations and nothing will happen to you. So there's no pressure to do anything even though you've become a signed-on member. That little caveat might end up being the saving grace for the Trudeau administration. At this current point in time, nobody really knows what Trudeau's even signed on to. The exact details of what actions are proposed are still hazy, but the New York Times reports that one proposal, out of the many that are in the document, is for social media firms to report software that directs users to violent content, and the government's also asking them to share more data with authorities. At face value, this single point appears to be fairly logical, but I just wonder if they really know what they're asking for here. What software directs users to extremist content? Well, the most basic answer to that is probably Google. Search engines direct users to that type of stuff. They need a means to find it, so the most basic way people find stuff on the internet? Search engines. Dig a little bit deeper, and you find that websites, in particular, are what users are discussing these types of things on. Well, maybe the websites are on the dark web, or maybe something more visible like 8chan. If they want social media companies to identify where people are going to get these kind of indoctrinations, then that's fine. But I'm just left wondering why government isn't able to discover this very basic level of research on their own. If the request truly is to understand the tools people use to direct themselves to dangerous content, that seems like something the government should have the capability to handle on their own without having to resort to social media companies' assistance. We have numerous cyber agencies. What are they doing? If all you have to do is locate web content tailored to these notions and track them to see how much traffic they're getting, I don't know, it seems quite basic to me. You see what's being posted and you monitor those websites if anything calls to violence, and then you administer the proper procedure to eliminate the threat. If they need social media companies who don't really even have authority over another webpage to assist them, then so be it. But I just feel like this is more for show and it's a shallow request. Websites that act as safe havens for radical people and radical ideas should 100% be monitored, but silencing them completely is a more complicated discussion, and that's where the controversy really is, because from these sentiments I've got from this meeting, that seems to be the path that these world leaders are trying to go down. I'll finish the article before I speak more on that. One of the blatant examples of Facebook failure is in relation to the shooting, where they allowed a live stream of the massacre to be up for nearly 17 minutes. After all that time, then it was finally taken down. That's just horrible. Imagine you're on your phone and you see something crazy being shared, like, hey, look at that, it's a bunch of guys killing some people. Without any shadow of a doubt, there is no place on Facebook for stuff like that, and it was up for far too long. But I'm wondering how they haven't developed some more sophisticated algorithms. If YouTube can take down my video in 5 seconds flat for simply having a Taylor Swift song in the background, social media algorithms should be able to respond to this in a more timely fashion. If you see a gun in the frame, maybe it has to get flagged for immediate review. These companies have enough money and time to have staff on duty 24/7, so that's a fair point of criticism. Another thing that was mentioned in the article was that the United States of America was not invited to attend the conference because of their concerns of limiting freedom of speech. As a result, they are now expected to sign on. Obviously, didn't invite them, they have not been a part of the discussion, it's very unlikely they sign any pledges as well. Personally, I think this was a horrible move, and it was very short-sighted. If you're preaching about bridging the gap, as these war leaders are doing, and working together, why go out of your way to exclude a major party? At the very least, extend the invite, and if they decide to not show up, that's one thing, but to not even try? It's highly ironic. The difference of opinion is perfectly reasonable to have, and it's coming from a logical place. Criticism of the censorship bill that they're proposing is logical. It's a sound discussion. Censorship talks are plagued by the possibility of destroying freedom of speech. It's a fact. If you banish the one group that's actively opposing the idea and you stop them from bringing up their notions to try and defend it, you get to thinking that your idea is perfect and it can never backfire. It's a recipe for disaster, and as I mentioned, narrow-minded decision making. It's childish and simply a foolish way to operate in terms of government policy. Everything sounds great and peachy when all the people around you are in complete unison and support, but that's not how you develop strong ideas and policies. Stupid approaches like this are just signals to how toxic politics has really become. You can't even have an open discussion, so all you're going to do is void it completely. Well, that's a shame because I'm here today to break down these arguments. Before I even get to that though, I want to acknowledge there is no polarization here. I fully understand that there's an issue, but at the same time, the proposals have major drawbacks and you need to be made aware of them. This is not the only way to handle things, and it's a very weird mindset people have developed. They think the one proposal that has the virtue signaling cape around it is the only way to do things, and any opposition is complete rejection of the notion that there's a problem here, but it's simply not the case. And I feel like if you listen to me logically, you'll definitely see where I'm coming from, and you'll realize just how silly these guys are acting. The first thing I want to bring up here is a quote from the New Zealand PM herself. She addresses the notion of freedom of speech, but there's nobody in attendance who can even rebuttal, so it's fairly useless, and she has a very misguided, I guess you could say, sight of what we're even trying to get at with that defense. She states that nobody has the right and freedom to broadcast mass murder. Of course, this is the most basic level of analysis you can make, and it really shows you she's not thinking that deeply. Everyone agrees with that. There is no argument there. No logical person is trying to defend people's rights to incite violence. She misses the mark entirely here, and it's very frustrating. It's the separation of violence and extremist notions that we're trying to combat. Violence is already illegal. You can't threaten someone, and let alone large groups. It's already not a thing. Everyone, or rather most logical people, are already in agreement with that notion. She's acting like Don Quixote fighting windmills out here. It's a non-combative statement to make. If someone is posting that they're going to shoot up a mosque or bomb an airplane, take that shit down and arrest the person immediately. The violence aspect has no qualms for me. That is a very rational and a strong proposal to make. Okay, granted, but this is not the same as talking about extremist ideas. Despite what they want you to believe, lumping together violence and extremist rhetoric and hate speech, they're not the same and they're very different. They need to be addressed independently because they are unique. To better illustrate that point, ask yourself this: what constitutes extremism? There are some very readily identifiable examples like white supremacy and radical Islam, but what happens when the goalposts start to shift? Hate speech, extremism, it's all very fluid terminology that can be applied to a wide variety of things depending on how you want to spin it. That is where the immense danger lies. Without the proper policies and a responsible government in place, it's very possible for hate speech and extremism to seep into the realm of criticism. What if I dislike the current government and rant about the bad things they do? In places like Russia, that's already called extremism. There's been cases of individuals insulting Putin and getting charged for it under the notion of hate speech, extremism, violent rhetoric, even though it's clearly not. The power to regulate speech is the same as the power to control every narrative. It's a major key to reaching a complete dictatorial level state. The government has no business restricting what we can and cannot discuss. It doesn't take a vivid imagination to see how that can go horribly wrong very fast. Of course, there are clear examples like the ones I mentioned before, but it's a very slippery slope to the bottom when it gets out of control. You can already get a sense of how vast the issue is with how little description the governments can offer up. They themselves can't even define to you what hate speech is. They can't even tell you how they define extremism. They can give you a couple examples, but the core, the definition that's going to be applied to all future cases, it's not there. If your proposal is to monitor white supremacists, that's good. If you want to monitor radical Islamists, that is good. If someone is talking about violence or trying to incite terror, take them down. That's not allowed. That is not the same thing as discussing an idea though. Speech is not violence per se, unless it's used in that specific violent context. I think the answer here is not censorship, but instead greater monitoring capacities placed on high-risk groups. At the slightest indication of danger, they need to be flagged and not let out of sight. Censorship might be valid in an ideal reality or a utopia, but it's heavily contingent on the government who's in control making the right calls every single time. In reality, we call the odds of that happening non-existent. We've seen it countless times throughout history. Losing the freedom of speech that we are lucky to have has immense potential to lead to terror. You already had talks of Canadian officials suggesting the control of social media to avoid corruption in the election. Can they not see how that is irony at its finest because it opens the gates to the doors of mass corruption itself? Having the government in control coming towards an election, they don't want to lose their spot. There's going to be a temptation there to shift the scales in their favor, and once you start manipulating that, it's a quick descent into hell. The saving grace here is that, as I mentioned before, the contract is non-binding, so there are not consequences for not following through. And this really makes me wonder why the contract was, I guess you could say, formulated like that. If I'm going to be pessimistic and cynical, I would assume that it gives these political figures the veil of doing something amazing, getting those brownie points for the election. Yeah, we're signing this bill, but there really is no accountability. So if they don't do anything, that's fine. They got the brownie points, they got the extra votes, and they're good to go. So in general, I'm kind of glad it worked out that way in this case, but for future contracts, there always has to be some accountability. Otherwise, it's pretty much useless, and that's just a general point. In this case, them not censoring our freedom of speech is a good thing. So kudos to whoever structured it. Maybe they saw the downfall coming and they did it that way for a reason. I think we can all acknowledge that violence has no place in a developed society, but the notions of hate speech and extremism, they're just far too vague and so easily manipulable for them to be conceivably used by governments in a positive way. If your standard definition comes down to if it offends you, then it's hate speech, well, I got news for you. Anything can offend anyone in a certain context, and there's going to be people out there who claim offense to whatever is said. Maybe that's not the criteria you want to use when you're defining hate speech, but I'm telling you, regardless of whatever you come up with, it's not going to be concrete enough. And at the end of the day, you really are entitled to your own individual thoughts and beliefs. You are not entitled to act on them though, especially if it puts other people at risk, as the PM said. I think the answer is zero tolerance for incitements to violence and strict watches on people who are engaging in high-risk forums. High risk can be defined by the likelihood of a group resorting to terrorism or committing some type of mass act of violence. This way we can crack down on the problem, but not put our speech at risk along the way. It seems like a very plausible answer to me that accomplishes the mission without nearly as much the potential for drawbacks. These talks of censorship are very dangerous and they need to be checked. The mark of a good thinker is someone who can always visualize how badly their ideas can descend into hell, so they can prepare for the negative outcomes adequately. It seems like very little of that has happened here, and it's just turned into strawman arguments and virtue signaling at its finest. Now, by a stroke of luck, We have a case example that was reported in the news today that's going to build on the censorship debate, and if you weren't convinced before, I feel like this case example here will do the job. The article in the paper today reads with a headline, "A radical individual claimed he arrived in Canada to deliver a terrible death to a woman called Asia Bibi after she escaped death row in Pakistan." Now you might ask yourself, why would he want to do that, and who is Bibi? Well, let's look at the backstory and go through that so you understand. Bibi arrived in Canada last week after escaping death in Pakistan. In 2010, she was accused of offending the Prophet Muhammad during a conversation with a group of women. This is a great example of where regulation goes horribly wrong, when the government bends it to their whims. Allegedly criticizing the Prophet is met with death. There's no freedom of speech, and there exists a massive impediment to rational discussions. Maybe the policy started with the best intentions, but this is where it is now. It wouldn't be manifested in Canada in the exact same manner, but a comparable situation is definitely within the realm of possibilities if things go slightly wrong. So, Bibi appealed to Pakistani officials, and the charge was dropped because she insisted she never said anything, and there wasn't really any evidence. She was released. This angered the Taliban, and they began to protest against her release. She was put in a risky situation either way. It was a lose-lose battle. Maybe the government wouldn't kill you anymore, but they have an extremist group at their disposal who would be more than willing to do the job instead. They began to hunt her down, and she was constantly living in fear. Trudeau reached out and welcomed her and her family into Canada. That's positive because things could have gotten really bad for her and her family over there. Now we fast forward to today. There is video evidence of an unidentified individual who claims he has arrived in Canada to stop Bibi from making more blasphemous comments. He then goes on to say he wants to deliver a terrible death to her and send her straight to hell. That is a clear example of where you can intervene and shut down this type of rhetoric. You cannot incite to violence. That is something we can all agree on, and there is no intelligent discussion to be had with something like that. This dude is literally saying he wants to send that lady to hell. Remove that content, don't inspire other like-minded individuals, and take this guy down. He shouldn't even be in Canada in the first place. This is the clearest distinction I can point out for you right now. Hate speech like Bibi's, allegedly insulting a prophet, versus a man literally inciting violence trying to kill someone. It's not the same thing, so these world leaders need to stop pretending like it is. The RCMP is currently on the case, and they have every right to take action here. If you want to be proactive, you could even make the argument that this man should not be allowed into Canada in the first place. Bibi does not deserve to have the threat of death follow her across the globe. This is where monitoring could have been effective though. In this case, it's difficult to monitor a foreign individual. It makes it harder because of things like government regulations. But if we caught on to his discussions of violent plans, preventive measures could have been enacted. And maybe not in this case, but apply it to a Canadian situation. It makes sense. The same thing can be said for white supremacists who make violent threats. The debate really is a critical one here, and I'm worried that those having it are not thinking logically. This has the power, the censorship notion, to shape our world, and maybe not in a good way. It's far too consequential to have narrow-minded discussions about it, and you have to hear the opposition out because it really matters. Formulate a stronger defense of your position, and if you can't, then it's a signal that you are wrong. On top of all this, as I've pointed out, there are clearly other alternatives that we can take that are not going to put our freedom of speech in danger. I simply don't see where they're coming from, and it makes almost zero sense to me. As you can probably tell, I'm very passionate about this subject because I feel like there's so many people who are making decisions who are not fully realizing the gravity of what's going on here. They're only seeing things with a one-track mind, and it's disastrous for everyone else. So that last notion there brings me to the end of my episode. Thanks for joining me on the Perry Platform. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and follow me on Twitter at Perry Platform. I'll see you soon.